The concepts of identity and suffering are undeniably linked. They are two essential parts of being human. To suffer forms us as we struggle to adapt, and in this process, a new identity emerges that is altered by our experiences. But what happens when your identity is already in fragments, and the suffering that you endure would break most people? This is the question that Senua's story answers. Senua is a warrior, and suffers from psychotic visions of violence and pain inspired by her history of loss. She carries with her the weight of the deaths of her people, including her lover Dillion. To drive this point home, Senua carries his literal skull with her, believing it to be the cradle of his soul. This not only serves as her motivation, but also as an albatross or penance, and a signal of her inability to accept the finality of death. She has convinced herself that her mission into Helheim, the Nordic version of Hell, is to liberate his tormented soul, seeking to conquer death and the demons of her past in order to do so. As she battles her way towards the goddess of death, she confronts forces from her past, which have come to define her and contribute to her fragmented psyche. These take horrifying forms, but the representations in her mind are not drawn up carelessly. Each of the main antagonists are representations of traumas of her past, and in confronting them, distinct parts of her are damaged, destroyed, or abandoned for the sake of the journey. Senua's mind, as it struggles with advanced psychosis, personifies the grief and loss that she has experienced. The use of fire as a force of targeted destruction, for example, consumes loved ones and sites of familiar comfort, such as her village and her people. Whether this is a memory of the Viking raids, which is less likely, as she was not present at the time of the attacks, or an imagining of the horrors that befell her fellow Picts is unclear. In order to advance through this stage of her journey, she must activate pyres around different villages. They erupt into flames and consume the villages and the people around her, which is telling of the guilt that she carries for the plague that she was blamed for bringing, and for not being there for Dillion when the Northmen came. This is confirmed by the frequent accusations by the voices in her head that it was all her fault. In a later vision, it is revealed that fire was the method of execution for her own mother. She had repressed this memory, but on her journey remembers the events and pieces together that it was Senua's own father who had sacrificed her. This stands in contrast to the original narrative presented in this section of the game, which focused on the cruelty of the Northmen and their use of fire as a means of terrorism. Senua's defeat of Surt at the end of this section symbolizes the greater victory over the forces of destruction in her life, both from within her village and from over the seas. Fighting the god of illusion, Valravn, Senua is confronted by parallel stories of deception. In facing the challenges of this region of hell, she solves puzzles that focus on changing her perspective to reveal a path that appears closed. She attempts multiple times to engage the god in direct combat, but is tricked into chasing fake figures. As the game progresses, it becomes clear that illusion is no stranger to Senua. She was deceived by all those around her, tricked into believing that she was lost and broken. Just like her fight against Valravn, she was presented with obstacles in her path, and was denied the perspective to see her way through. The sheltering and isolation that she endured at the hands of her father was only broken by Dillion. This pattern is essential to understanding her journey. The thought patterns and restrictions that have plagued Senua, from her scarring experiences to her ongoing mental illness, are interrupted by Dillion's view of who she was and what she could see that others could not. By abandoning the old, destructive patterns of thought instilled in her by her father, she is able to see a way forward in both a real and figurative sense. In this portion of Senua's journey, she has just lost her sword in her first confrontation with the goddess of death, a giantess named Hela. In order to reforge it, she must face a series of trials which appear to be images of past events filtered through the lens of psychosis. She wanders the halls of the dead and faces the plague that fell upon her people. But most importantly, she faces the stigma which would follow her for the entirety of her early life. In one section, she runs from a crowd of her neighbors who call for her in hopes of burning her alive to save them from the pestilence. This is one of the most pronounced moments of acknowledgement regarding the cost of living with mental illness. The isolation and disdain that Senua suffered due to the misguided efforts of her father and the ignorance of her people must be overcome before she can continue. To obtain one of the fragments of the sword, she must find her way through the dark and confining burial mounds. At the end of the maze, she is confronted with the memory of leaving her father to attempt to purge her darkness in the wilds. This was a common practice for the time, especially for the Pict peoples of Orkney. where Senua is born and raised. He hits her across the face, revealing that physical abuse was a reality for her. The stifling, dark, and isolating environment of the burial mounds mirrors her own early life. Overcoming it means facing the memories of her totalitarian father. The next fragment requires Senua to confront the memory of the plague which tore through her lands. She wades through a stagnant and pestilent swamp filled with the bodies of those who have died of the illness. As she progresses, she is chased by a ball of fire, which emits the angry voices of a mob looking to exact revenge against her. She was blamed for the plague, as the stigma that her psychosis carried made her an easy target. After escaping the fire, Senua is faced with a puzzle, in which she must view the same world through two perspectives. In order for her to switch between these versions of reality, she must focus on a mask that acts as a portal of sorts. The first view is stormy and dark, and the other is clear and bright. She cannot progress without using both. They represent the perspectives of her father and of Dillion, respectively. In this trial, she is forced to confront the reality of her isolation as a matter of perspective that was imposed by her father. Dillion's ability to cut through that veil was vital for Senua's journey of liberation from her darkness. In this way, Senua is driven to accept her mental illness as a part of her, and at the same time overcome its stranglehold on her life. This forces the once clashing worldviews to be considered together in order to progress. The result is a worldview which is not created by an outside force, Dillion or her father, but one of her own making. It is also worth noting that the two views of the world represented in this section show a particularly empathetic take on mental illness more generally. In many ways, Senua's Sacrifice takes the kind of leap that any innovative story should. It challenges the prepackaged narratives that the public is often given regarding those among us who live with mental illness. By showing that the gift of a unique perspective is not erased by the suffering that it may cause, we are reminded that there is a human being there, who deserves to be understood as much as anyone else. More than most others, this part of the game highlights the link between Senua's process of grieving and her journey of self-actualization and liberation from her past. The use of darkness as a physical representation of Senua's mental illness is used throughout the story. The main enemy in this area of hell is a massive hound-like creature called the Beast, which cannot be seen, but stalks her from the shadows. The voice of the creature is the voice which is used to torment her throughout her journey, a deep and demonic voice. Later it is revealed that this voice is also used for the memories of her father, and for her own voice when she belittles herself in the mirror. This is meant to display just how deeply the psychological and physical abuse by her father affected her, when coupled with her mental illness. She now carries his voice in her head, which breaks her down, but claims to be protecting her, just as he did in her early life. During this phase of the game, a narrating voice describes how Dillion was her real guide, and compares him to a small light in a dark and cruel world. Considering that her psychosis is referred to as her darkness, the importance of her relationship, but also her dependence on it, are made clear in the fact that she must cling to the light to avoid the monster which hunts her from the shadows. It is after defeating the creature that she is able to remember the horrors that her father had caused in her life. Just before her final confrontation with Hela, Senua is confronted with the image of her own mother consumed by flames. Besides being one of the most emotionally intense scenes in the game, it reveals an important realization about the main character. She is confronted with the truth that her mother was consumed by the same mental illness that she had passed down to Senua, and that ultimately it led to her death. All of this leads to her final confrontation with the goddess of death, in which we are led to believe that she loses it first. As Senua is stabbed and lays dying, she is face to face with a reflection of Dillion, who tells her that she should not fear death. It appears that she bleeds out here, but then the camera pans out to reveal that the goddess of death has been replaced by Senua herself. The woman bleeding to death on the ground is not Senua, or at least not all of Senua. Rather, it is the part of Senua that feared death, and fought to destroy it. In the end, it was not death that she kills, but the part of her that allowed death to control her. If this sounds far-fetched, it is actually foreshadowed earlier in the game. Senua reaches a point of no return, entering a portal to her final battle. A version of herself is left behind, which screams and disintegrates after voicing her doubt that they would survive. This is the part of her that lacked the resolve to face death at all. In the end, Senua and death are merged. She says goodbye to Dillion and casts his skull into the abyss. It may be tempting to think that this is the sacrifice referenced in the title. That was my initial reaction as well. But as you look back on the journey that she has been on from the beginning, it appears that her real sacrifice are the parts of herself that could not cope with the imminence of death and the realities of living with advanced psychosis. It is a bittersweet ending, which ties together a beautiful story. Bitter because in the end Senua, like the rest of us, cannot conquer death, but sweet because by making peace with it, Senua can finally live free just as Dillion would have wanted.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching, and a very special thank you to Lexifer for providing the script editing and motivation for this video.